Dr. Monica McHale-Small is currently an adjunct assistant professor at Temple University in Pennsylvania. She is also a retired public school educator after 27 years of service in Pennsylvania. Monica started her career as a school psychologist, but spent the last 14 years in a variety of administrative positions, including most recently a superintendent. Dr. McHale-Small has long advocated bringing sound research into practice in public schools, including Pennsylvania's dyslexia screening and early literacy intervention pilot, designed to support research-based learning, research-based structured literacy and interventions beginning in kindergarten. Dr. McHale-Small has had many accolades and accomplishments throughout her career. Currently, she is the president of the Learning Disability Association of America. I am very excited to interview today's guest on dyslexia through a superintendent's lens. So let's take a look at the interview questions. Hey, hello, and welcome back to Think Dyslexia Network. I am Dr. Lauren, and my guest today is Dr. Monica McHale-Small. So thank you for finding time to come on the show. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to have this opportunity to chat with you.
Excellent. So as my audience knows, I like to outline 4 questions that we will delve into. So the first question is more so touching on what drove you to reach the highest level to be a superintendent. Really excited about that, given all of the many places and hats you've worn in your career. The second question is talking about, was your school district allowed to say dyslexia when you were an administrator?
Mm-hmm.
The third question is kind of focusing more on women as superintendents. So I'll delve into that once we get there. And then the last one is talking about the overrepresentation of Black students, more so Black males, and how you led that, or navigated, I should say, through that space. I'm curious to know, did you use more of your school psychologist hat or your superintendent hat? So let's delve into the questions a little bit more deeply. So the first question, I know in your former life, you were a school psychologist and you also have children with dyslexia yourself. So
Right.
what drove you to go straight to the top to become a superintendent of a school district? And I always want to know, what was your why?
Okay, that's a good question. And I think I have to stress that I didn't go straight to the top. I spent 14 years as a school psychologist. And during most of those 14 years, I never even thought about going into administration, period.
Okay.
And in fact, I can remember some times when my dad would ask me, did I ever think about that? And I was like, oh no, I'm never doing that, not even giving that a thought. And then I moved into a position in the Westchester area school district outside of Philadelphia. And it was the superintendent who approached me about, had I ever thought about becoming an administrator? And once again, I said, no, that's not for me. But he was persistent and he asked again. And I had the opportunity to kind of enter into what they were calling a leadership fast track. So they were helping me with the tuition to get my supervisory certificate. So
wow.
I went, I got to go to Lehigh University and I got my supervisor of pupil services certificate, and that enabled me to supervise psychologists and counselors and nurses and all the support folks that are in school districts. And it was a great opportunity for me there in Westchester because it was a rather large district for Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has a lot of small districts. We have 500 districts. We're not a county-based system like Maryland is, but we have a whole lot, and some of them are pretty big, like Philadelphia. And then there's another tier, and Westchester would fit in that next tier down. So we had, at the time I was there, around 22,000 students.
Wow.
And we were very well-resourced school district, and we had a lot of school psychologists, counselors, nurses, and intervention specialists and social workers. So it was a great opportunity for me because I was able to, really use all the skill set that I learned in my graduate program and supervise all these different folks and really have a role in making our student services program much more robust. And it was also in that district, which is, it wasn't, I wouldn't say it's where I became interested in issues around disparities and diversity, but it was a district that was very involved in that during my time in it as an administrator. So I can talk probably more about that when we get to that last question. But anyway, so I became an administrator. I spent 8 years in that district. And during that time, I thought, if I'm going to do this, I might as well go all the way, right? Why not go to the top? And it's interesting because I had a conversation with that same superintendent who encouraged me to go into administration. And I said, so what do you think? Do you think I could become a superintendent? And he said no. So I took that as a bit of a challenge, but he didn't say no because he didn't think I had the competency. He said no because he knew me well enough to know that I would be very frustrated.
Right. Okay.
But I, took it as a challenge. And I'm like, well, I'll show you. So I had to make the leap over to the regular ed side to really become a superintendent, right? All my experience was really around pupil services and special education. So I had to make that move to the regular ed side. And in that district, I did have opportunities to be part of like curriculum development teams. So I had some experiences, but I had to leave Westchester. I got a job as director of secondary teaching and learning in another district outside of in suburban Philadelphia. And I spent 3 years there. And then I moved to another district outside of Philadelphia, where I became assistant superintendent. And then, from there, I moved on into the superintendency, which I think then kind of leads into the next question. But before we go into the next question, the why wasn't just about like, I want to do this because it's a challenge. It was really because I felt like as a school psychologist, often I was putting out fires and I was trying to change the world one kid at a time, which is probably how we have to do it. But I felt like, well, maybe I should think about this administration thing because you can have broader impact when, when you're working with the adults who are working with children. So I kind of figured, well, I'll have the opportunity to touch many more children's lives as an administrator. So that was kind of my journey of how I got there. And then the driver really was trying to have an impact, trying to make things better. And really, as a school psychologist, when I would get frustrated in that role, when I felt like we weren't meeting a child's needs, it was really a lot of systemic barriers. And to be able to overcome those barriers, you really do have to be in a position where you have more influence over policy and practice in the district.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm glad you corrected me when I said straight to the top, because obviously no one just leaves the classroom and becomes a superintendent. Right. But I just find your career path just so interesting. So I really appreciate you really explaining how you got there in depth, especially for our audience to hear that as well. So the next question is really more about dyslexia. So when you were the superintendent of the school district for 3 years, correct?
Correct.
Yes. So what was the dyslexia policy? Were teachers allowed to say dyslexia at the IEP tables? Were they allowed to put it on the IEP? What did that look like? And how did you interact with administrators about that?
Okay. So I'll even back up because those opportunities really presented themselves even before I got to the superintendency. So in my other administrative positions, and now we can kind of touch on my children. So when I became a school psychologist, my I had two children, and they were very young. And I think my first full-time year as a school psychologist was the year my daughter started kindergarten. And then I had two others along the way. But anyway, becoming a school psychologist had nothing to do with having children with learning disabilities, because I hadn't had them yet. And it's interesting because, you don't really think about that. And that's also a journey and a process, right? You can be the school psychologist and you can work with other families and help them kind of accept and understand their child. But then when you have to do that as a mom, it's a whole different story. So, and I marveled at that throughout my career, that no matter how much experience and knowledge I had when it was my own children, it was a much more emotional journey and conversation. And I would get butterflies in my stomach before IEP meetings, just like I hear from many parents. So it didn't protect me from that. But certainly as my own children started to struggle, and as I felt as a school psychologist that I wasn't doing the best job at really helping children understand themselves as learners and helping families understand their child, I really started to learn a whole lot more about reading, because most kids who are evaluated for special education or possible learning disabilities are struggling in reading. Not all, we certainly have kids with other disabilities and emotional and social and behavioral challenges, but a great deal of the students that come to us as a school psychologist struggle with reading. And my own children struggled with reading. So I really became a student of reading. And also in that same district where I became an administrator, I was very lucky that we had an assistant superintendent who heard that Sally Shaywitz was going to be presenting locally. And she took a whole bunch of us to see Dr. Shaywitz present.
Oh,
yeah,
wow.
she took, I know. Oh, wow, I was right? Because that wasn't happening that much. And this was way back. I would say this was probably in like 2003, 2004, somewhere in there. So it was quite a while ago. And, and that really struck me, because I had already gotten to the point where I was like, well, we need to call this what it is. We know a lot about dyslexia. We need to call it that. Yes, it's a learning disability. Yes, a child would qualify under IDEA as learning disabled, but it's dyslexia, so let's call it that. And then when that assistant superintendent, Dr. Linda Antonovich, had taken us to see Dr. Shaywitz, and then we came back as a team and really kind of discuss that and parse through it, and how is this going to change our practice. And it changed practice in a very positive way, in that we really looked at the intervention services that we were offering in the district to make sure that we were doing the right thing, that we had teachers trained in Wilson and in other methodologies. We also looked at our core curriculum. So it was modeled for me that this was something that we could do. And then I took that with me when I moved on and went to other districts as director of teaching and learning and assistant superintendent. In the district where I was assistant superintendent, I was very lucky that I had a lot of influence over curriculum and instruction. And I had an elementary education director who was also very interested in reading. And we worked together to look at, how to revise or how to supplement our curriculum in that district. And we found out about the Super Kids reading curriculum. I don't know if you're familiar with Super Kids. It's a wonderful structured literacy, science-based curriculum that's not widely used. It is a K-2 curriculum. You probably have heard of the American Girl dolls.
Of course.
Okay. Well,
myself when I was a kid.
Yes. Yeah. Well, Pleasant Rowland, who is the creator of those dolls, is also the creator of the Super Kids reading curriculum.
Good to know.
Yes. Yeah, and it's a great curriculum, but like I said, it's only K-2, and for some reason in public schools, at least, we have this thing where we like curricula that's K-6 or K-8 or K-12, and we have some kind of weird hang up about K-2. But this program is designed, it's very much focused on phonological development and phonetic development. And but if you follow the entire curriculum, the children have been directly instructed in all the different decoding patterns by the time they are finished it in second grade.
Wow.
So yes, it's a beautiful program. I don't understand why more people don't use it. Pleasant Rowland did sell it to Zaner Blauser, I think, Zaner Blauser, Zaner Blauser, however you pronounce that. But it's still an excellent program. And in that school district where I was assistant superintendent in Salem Township, we used that in our elementary schools. And then we also trained our reading specialists and our special education teachers in Wilson. So we had that opportunity to make sure kids were not just getting core curriculum that was based on the science of reading, but also that they had the opportunity to have intervention with trained interventionists. And while working on that, I would go to reading conference, like all of us reading dyslexia geeks, right? We're always going to reading conferences or reading workshops. So I was at one, and people were talking about how public schools were doing such a lousy job working with kids with dyslexia. So I said, wait a minute, let me tell you, there's some schools out there and we're trying really hard and we're doing good things. And from there, I got pulled into a project in Pennsylvania. There was a grassroots handful of parents who got a piece of legislation passed in Pennsylvania called the Pennsylvania Dyslexia Screening and Early Literacy Intervention Pilot. Yes. So I was part of that group that worked on that. And then I moved on to be part of the advisory committee for that. But as we fleshed out that whole pilot program and what it was going to look like, and what we were trying to do is to make sure that schools had evidence-based core curriculum, and that the children who were exhibiting risk for dyslexia would get intervention beginning in kindergarten,
Right.
Which doesn't really sound revolutionary, but there are still many schools, especially public schools, who don't intervene early enough. So that was how we set up that program. And then around the same time in 2014, I got the superintendent position. And I was able to, even though our district that I was in was not part of that pilot, I lucked out. When I got there, the teachers were really saying, we need to do something different. Our reading scores are not good. It's time to look at our English language arts curriculum. So it was perfect timing. So I brought the Super Kids program, and we found, and based on what we were doing in the pilot, I was able to use some of those connections and some of what I learned through developing that program. And we trained special ed teachers and reading specialists in Gillingham. And we collaborated with Fairleigh Dickinson University.
Yes.
And we had a whole cadre of interventionists trained. And so we replicated that pilot program, in that our kiddos got that intervention. They didn't have to have an IEP. They didn't have to be labeled as dyslexic, but if they were showing that risk, because they had weak word reading and decoding skills or phonologic skills, they got that intervention. And then our OG trained interventionists in that district, because we realized, it's not just the kids who are coming in, but they also, we got to be very creative with schedules, and we were able to give that OG intervention to kids through middle school. And that was definitely the advantage of being a superintendent, because when you're a superintendent, you can remove barriers and make things happen much more easily and quickly. And from what I understand, because I'm still in contact with some of those folks, that many of those components continue to be in place. And they continue to be in place because even though there was some pushback from parents, data doesn't lie. And when kids can read and scores go up, that's evidence of success. So,
wow, that's amazing. I love how you, again, broke everything down to build up to what was done, and the the impact and I guess I should say power that you had to help implement this program to make a change. So thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
Yes. So I want to shift the question just because I think that this is important. As women, I I want to hear your perspective. So USA Today put out an article back in February of 2021 discussing the gender gap between school superintendents. And so the article highlights about 76% of the nation's K through 12 educators are women, but only 24% are superintendents. So I guess my question for you is, were you the first woman superintendent in your school district? Did you feel like it was a lot harder to get the job done? Because I know through my perspective, I feel like I've mostly always seen men. So I'm
Yeah.
curious to know what your experience was.
Well, the district that did hire me as superintendent had a previous, in fact, a long-term superintendent before me who was also a woman.
Oh, great.
So that I don't think in that particular, I know that being a woman was not a critical factor in that school district and in hiring me. However, as I was thinking about this question that you sent me, and initially I was like, no, because they had a previous woman, no, it wasn't an issue. But what was an issue is that it took me a while to land a superintendency. And what I would find is invariably when I didn't get the job and I was a finalist in a number of districts, it would more often go to men, and sometimes men with less years of experience or less varied experience. So I do think probably it made it a bit more difficult to get the position. But like I said, I was fortunate to work in a district that already had experience working with a female superintendent. So I don't think in the district it was that big of an issue. Now, when you're a superintendent, you're not just working in isolation. You often meet with the other superintendents in the region where you're working. And there were probably instances that I can remember where maybe I didn't feel my voice may have been heard as well as some other folks. But when there was the controversy with Dr. Joe Biden being called Dr. Joe Biden, that really kind of resonated with me, because I often remember being in rooms full of superintendents. Most of, if not all, had their doctorates, and people would go around the room if we had a guest come in, a guest speaker or something for one of these meetings. And very often I would find that the men were always introduced as Dr. whoever, but there were notable occasions where the women were introduced by their first name. And that is something that I found throughout my career, that men were always introduced using their titles,
Right.
and women, yeah. So,
Wow.
but I don't think, like I said, I don't think gender was a huge issue once I got there. And now, what was interesting to me in the district where I worked is that there were what probably became a more difficult issue for me to navigate was more of a political issue.
Mm-hmm.
So I personally am very much a progressive. I'm a Democrat. I'm a progressive Democrat, and in my feelings and my thoughts and ideas about how education should be done is reflective of who I am politically and philosophically. And the school district where I was very conservative, and I certainly was not the only Democrat. There were definitely other Democrats, but there were more conservative Republicans, and even outside of Democrat versus Republicans, there were more conservatives and people who had different ideas about how education should look and how it should be done. So that was probably a little bit more difficult for me to navigate, but I did have a lot of success, even though I chose to leave the district. And after 3 years, my contract had been renewed by that school board for another 3 years, but I decided to leave. But what I want to note is that some of the people who I worked very closely with and who I felt very connected with and very supported as far as our school board members were very politically different from me.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's important for people to always remember that when you can focus, at least in education, when we can always bring it back to kids and what's best for kids, I do believe that most people who are out there in education, whether they're in the classroom or a principal, an administrator, or a school board member, that most people are there because they want the best things for children.
Absolutely.
And the way that I navigated those political and philosophical differences was to really keep it child focused.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that you can make great things happen when you focus on kids.
Absolutely. I appreciate you sharing the gender perspective, but also the political perspective. I feel as if the higher you go up in any position, you're going to face politics. So whether it's like school district politics or political global politics, I mean, there's always something that, as you said earlier in this interview, kind of makes the job a bit harder.
Yes,
So,
absolutely. And that superintendent who said that he didn't think I would make a great superintendent, that's what he understood about me. He understood that, I get a little frustrated. I have very strong opinions, and when I want something done, I want it done. So
right. Absolutely.
That can be a challenge when you're in a position that, like you said, is very in nature is a political position. Yeah.
So that actually leads me to my last question, which I know our interview is coming close to an end, and I know that this could probably be another conversation within itself, but I still want to touch on this. So when you are in a position of power, sometimes you can't unsee certain things, right? And so the overrepresentation of Black students, more specifically Black males, are identified with special education services, and more than often they're labeled with an emotional disability or an intellectual disability. And I know we've had a podcast about this, and that's not always accurate. And
right.
Often the root cause really is a reading disability, whether it's dyslexia or some other reading disability or a language processing difference. So I really want to know, given everything that you have accomplished, when you were leading in your role as superintendent, were you thinking more of your school psychologist hat? Were you thinking more of, I'm in a position of power and I can make a difference or break down those barriers as a superintendent? How did you lead with really this systemic issue?
Well, I was switching my hats all the time. I will say that even though there are not a lot of school psychologists who go to, into administration and to the superintendency, I think our skill set serves us very well in that role, because we are always we're people watchers, right? We're watching how people react to things. We're trying to kind of read the situation, modify the environment to get the best out of everyone. So there were a lot of things that I learned as a school psychologist that became very useful to me. But, I will say, even my entire time as an administrator, I've always, and even before as a school psychologist, and it definitely came from my training at University of Pennsylvania, and it was probably just something that was born to me. I recently found out that I had a great uncle who was very active in the civil rights era and civil rights movement in Philadelphia. And I had no idea that he was so active. So I think I got his gene that just made me very social justice oriented. But in every role that I've been in, I've really tried to bring an equity lens. And what that's going to mean is very different, because school districts are different, and the issues that are the issues are going to be different. But like you said, no matter what district I was in, I always saw that bias where when kids of especially Black boys were acting out, the go-to was, oh, they're emotionally disturbed,
right?
Right? And more often than not, truly more often than not, when you really take the time to parse it all out, you see that this kid is not having success academically. And it was very often related to reading skills. So, just working with people to have them look more holistically at kids and try to get to the root cause of what behavior is will often lead you to the right answer. But then always looking at data with that equity lens. And like I said, it was different in different places. In some of the districts, we absolutely had overrepresentation in certain special education categories or more restrictive settings, like an emotional support classroom where kids spent very little time in the regular class. We also, I noticed that we would have children who were very capable, but our Black students were often not put into the higher level math and science courses or AP courses. And I would pull out the data because we would make these decisions based on achievement scores. I'd be like, well, wait a minute, what about this kid? Why, look, this kid has the same scores here and he's not in this class. Why not? And it would be like, well, he doesn't have a lot of support at home, and sometimes they didn't even know that, but they made an assumption based on the color of someone's skin, that they didn't have support at home or it would be too much for them. So, I saw different problems in different places. Right. Definitely the disproportionality as far as exclusionary discipline, and that would happen with our students of color and our students with disabilities. So, I think it's really important for leaders to bring that equity lens to data analysis and really look at who is thriving in the district and who isn't. And then every district is going to have different reasons for the kids who aren't thriving, why that is, and it's going to have different solutions. But you have to have the courageous conversations. If you're not willing to do that as a school leader, then maybe that's not for you then, because we know, and but the pandemic has kind of blown the lid off it, right? We now know just how much of an issue of equity is in our schools, right? We know that some schools kids don't have access by virtue of where they go to school. And we can't not see that anymore. We can't not see that anymore as an entire society. And we have to be willing to meet it head on and to figure out what the issue is for any specific system and deal with that head on.
Absolutely. Well, Monica, thank you so much for your insights, sharing your experiences. I really feel this was such an impactful conversation. I do want to share to the audience out there that Dr. Monica has actually written an excellent blog post for my website. So I'm going to put that in the show notes for everyone to view that. And it's how saying dyslexia can really be life-changing. So thank you so much. And hopefully we can have you back on the show again for another conversation. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.